Hi. Non-conformity by W.B. Selbie, published in 1912. Apparently regarded now as a classic. I know the phrase or word non-conformity doesn't mean much to us today, but back in the day, the Victorian era, it was a word that was used as an umbrella term for all the churches outside the Catholic that differed from and were dissident from the Church of England, the official church of Great Britain. So the nonconformist churches would of course include the Presbyterians and the Baptists and the Methodists and smaller and newer cliques or sects like the Brethren that had just been formed in the late Victorian era. Selbie's talking about the trend among those churches, and if you've seen one of our other videos on Alfred Garvey's book on monotony, you have some of this background from the same period. You also have it in the track or the video we just did on destructive religious groups. So we asked the question on one of those videos, why is it that the cults suddenly arrived on the scene in the 1830s through 1900? What was going on? Well, Selbie's talking about that same period from the standpoint of the churches in Great Britain specifically, and he says this: it would certainly seem that we have now reached a period of religious reaction, of an ebb tide in spiritual things. It does not need any show of statistics, any counting of heads, to prove to us that the great mass of the people of this country are profoundly indifferent to all the churches and to religion as represented by them. The advance in scientific discovery and in temporal well-being, in other words, the advance of progress of materialism, brought about a spirit of practical materialism, which tends to make religion both unnecessary and unreal. It is quite true, as every careful observer must realize, that this is only part of a general decadence that marks our general civilization. So Selbie points out that progress in material things tends to lead, in the pattern of history, to decline in religious faith. Okay, in 1912, how did it look going forward? And don't forget, this is 2 years before World War I and the same year as the sinking of the Titanic, which many took, even at the time, as being symbolic of something that was lost in the advance of civilization. So this is Selbie's analysis of where we're going and the state of the churches at the time. The dangers and difficulties of a position like this, that is the state of the churches at the time, lie on the surface. To maintain it, that is stability in any sound and reasonable way, requires real faith and is something almost beyond the capacity of the average man. Sight is so much simpler and easier than faith. To accept a verbal statement of a creed and swear to it on all occasions, or to commit oneself to an authoritative church and let the church do the thinking while her sons passively accept her conclusions, is for most people the line of least resistance. On the other hand, to keep an open mind is a difficult and uncomfortable thing, especially as it is not always easy to see where it will lead. It is no wonder that many observers attribute the stagnation of the free churches, another name for the nonconformist churches, at the present time, the stagnation of the free churches at the present time, they are stagnant, he says, because of the theological unrest and the people, therefore, in the free churches, as well as the mainstream churches, the Anglican and the Catholic, long for the safer dogmatism of a former age, he says. Such an attitude is neither brave nor sane. It is impossible to put back the hands of the clock, and the churches must be able to speak to the men of today in language that they can understand and in the terms of the current intellectual life, or they will cease to appeal at all. So he's saying that the intellectual changes, specifically from the period of, let's say, the 1850s, when Darwin and the higher criticism of the Bible came along, these intellectual changes overwhelm the average man who's not feeling he can cope with them. So he either drifts out of the church or he drifts to a dogmatic ritualism. And the Anglican Church had already experienced that, because many Anglicans, also unseated by the restlessness of that era, moved over to the from the Anglican uncertainties to the Catholic certainties during that very period. And the free churches, being less trammeled by creedal formulas, he says, have here a very great opportunity, and many of them are using it not unworthily. The unrest of which so much is heard will not trouble us very long. Indeed, it is already giving way to a larger and saner faith, which is based on experience and grounded in fact. Well, that may be true for the intellectuals of 1912, but it's certainly not true, as he says just before this, for the average person who felt uncertain and wanted either to retreat to the dogmatism of before, or worse, drifted away from the church altogether. It was not only among the more intelligent middle class people, where their chief strength has always been, that the free churches seem to be losing hold. A far more serious sign of the times is their lack of progress among the laboring and artisan classes. It is easy to exaggerate the extent of this, and it is only right to remember that in many districts Methodism has a large hold among working folk, and that the Brotherhood and adult school movements are also almost exclusively recruited from the working classes. But when every allowance has been made in this way, it still remains true that the great masses of the wage-earning population are altogether alienated from the churches, whether nonconformist or Anglican. The reasons for this are predominantly social. In the large towns, working men realize that the churches belong rather to the order of the employers than of the employed. They are democratic only in name, and both their government and finance are so arranged as to suit the haves rather than the have-nots. In other respects, the complaint is made that the churches are too comfortable and too respectable, and people who are neither of these things do not find in them what they need. The salvation which they preach is said to make too little allowance for a man's bodily needs and material surroundings. In the present state of the industrial world, a gospel which only takes account of things spiritual does not easily commend itself to those who are bearing the heat and burden of the day. Now, exaggerated as these contentions often are, there is much truth in them. They at least supply quite sufficient ground for the attitude of indifference to religion, which is normal among working men. Now, we could add to this that Selbie's not looking at the cults here. In 1912, the cults had made virtually no penetration in Great Britain, very little even in North America, compared to 100 years later today. So what is it that gives the cults, beyond the sects, beyond the free churches, beyond the so-called nonconformists of yesteryear, what gives the cults their impetus? And I would suggest, and maybe Selbie would too if he were with us today, that it has a lot to do with the hope the churches were offering. The earth was not the subject of their sermons in those days. Even current life was not the subject of sermons in most churches in those days. It was about getting to heaven. And as Tom Wright has pointed out in numerous of his YouTube videos, this emphasis upon heaven makes the church irrelevant and really unreal to most people of the last few generations. So the eschatology, or the neglect of eschatology, in the churches as a whole, before 1912 and up till today in many cases, is one of the reasons the cults flourish, and one of the reasons the common man drifts away. So if the average person is more drawn to the cults than he is to the free churches or the older mainstream churches, it tends to be because of the nature of the hope that the cults promise. As Van Balen said in the first big book about the cults some 3 generations ago, Van Balen wrote a book called The Chaos of the Cults. And in that book he left us a very famous phrase. He said that the cults are the unpaid bills of the church. To the extent that we neglect eschatology, the doctrine of the last things, the cults will flourish.